Hello, everybody. Well, to have you here today for our next in our series of talks in this area of social cybersecurity. Our speaker today is Josh Tucker, and Josh comes to us from New York, literally, and he's really well known for his work on politics and social media. Some of his work has actually looked at trying to popular rumors about how people are affected on social media in terms of political behavior and checking out whether or not that's actually true. He's director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, so his other hat is he knows everything about Russian studies. He's also the co-director of NYU's Social Media and Political Participation Lab, which is better known as the famous SMAP Lab. And under that guise, not only has he done a lot of work with social media and politics, he and the SMAP Lab have actually developed a number of algorithms that they have made available for things like URL expansion and various social media support tools. So today he's going to talk to us about the truth about fake news. And with that, I turn you over to Josh.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks so much for all of you for joining us today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the invitation. And in this brand new world of sort of virtual talks, one of the exciting things about it is it's easier to bring along your co-authors. So I will point out that two of the co-authors on this paper who've done a ton of work on this overall project that I'll be telling you about, Kevin Aslett and Zeev Sanderson, are both here as well. So I may bring them in for question and answer at various points in time. So anyway, thanks everybody for being here today. So this is, all right, the work I'm going to be showing you today is part of a large project. And today I'm going to be trying to give you, and we're sort of, the research questions that I'm going to end the talk today by telling you where the whole project is going. The research questions we're going to be talking about in the talk today here are as follows. First, can individuals distinguish between true and false news in real time? Or can individuals assess the veracity of news that's brand new, news stories that have just appeared, the way many people would go and encounter news stories? Second question, research question we're going to try to answer today, are there large partisan differences in performance? The third is going to be what makes people better and worse at this task, and are there interventions that we can take that would improve people's performance in this regard? And finally, this is all part of a larger project where we're trying to understand whether or not fact-checking news can be crowdsourced in real time, which would have tremendous implications for how platforms in particular deal with false news, but also in terms of just can we use ordinary people to extract signal. And I'm going to do less presentation than that because that work is more ongoing right now, but that's kind of part of where this is all going. And then at the end of the talk, I'll kind of give you much more specifics on where we're going. So the overview of the study, basically the study from what I'm going to be showing you today was conducted, the data gathering portion of this was conducted from November 21st, 2019 to February 8th, 2020. So we did this for basically about 3 weeks. Individuals were shown articles within 24 to 48 hours of publication and asked whether they were to rank them as whether they were true or false or misleading, and lots of other questions about them. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And all of the articles were also rated by professional fact checkers. And we collected a whole bunch of covariates about people in the process of doing this. So we were asking them survey questions as well. So in terms of the types of evaluations of these news sources, both the respondents and the professional fact checkers answered two types of questions to address the veracity of these news sources. The first was we asked them a categorical question. So was the article, and we gave them 3 categories: true, false or misleading, or could not determine. We then subsequently asked them if they said false or misleading, whether they thought it was false or it was misleading, but based on some pre-testing work we did, we combined that into a single category, and everything I'm going to show you today on the categorical answers will be, we'll have these 3 answers there. The second thing we did was what we called the veracity scale. And so the veracity scale asked people how they would rate the article on a standard kind of Likert type scale. But in this case, we went from 1, definitely not true, to 7, definitely true. Most of what I'm going to show you today is about our assessment of how they performed on the categorical category, but I'll show you some, kind of, you can think of it as almost as robustness tests or subsidiary research on the veracity scales as well over the course of the talk. So the details of the study is that we ended up with about 150 total articles that appeared within 24 hours of publication. The way we did this over that 13-week period with some breaks for vacation was we sent out 5 articles per day. And one of the things that's innovative about what we did here is that we took ourselves out of the process of selecting what articles we would send to people for fact checking. So what we did was we pre-registered a totally replicable selection process, which any of you could go ahead and institute the same selection process as well. So we got the researcher choosing the articles out of the process. And the way we did this was we had 5 streams of news. So these streams were 2 from what we called sort of mainstream news sources, and 3 from what we called suspect news sources. The mainstream news sources we then divided into left news sources and more left-wing and more right-wing mainstream news sources. And the suspect news sources we divided into left, right, and then a third category, which we actually couldn't really tell whether it had a left or right bias, either because it was proposing some left, putting out some sort of left-leaning stuff, some sort of right-leaning stuff, or it was doing both of the two, or it was doing neither of them. And so from each of these streams, each morning, we would select the most popular article that had appeared in the last 24 hours. And then we would immediately send that out to both our crowds and our professional fact checkers. Now we asked each of our crowd members to evaluate 3 articles. So we went out so each article ended up being checked by 90 people from the crowd. So we have a crowd of 90 people for each day. So we went out to 150 people per day. We gave them 3 articles each. That gave us 90 respondents per articles. Then we used our fact checkers to provide the ground truth of whether or not what the correct answer was to ranking the article as false, misleading, true, or could not determine. And on top of this, we also conducted 3 supplemental experimental studies, one of which was a 2x2 study, so we were able to look at treatments, where for 2 weeks we ran these supplemental experimental studies where the main study functioned as the control group, and then we had these experimental studies, which I'll tell you about layered on top of it. So that's basically what we were doing. Here's a nice graphic to give you a sort of sense of this that I use for a more public-facing talk. But basically, we have the 5 news streams coming in every day. These are, from our mainstream, left-wing, right-wing, and then these are from our more suspect news sources, right, left, and can't tell. They would come into us, and we would simultaneously send them out to the fact checkers and to the crowd. All right. So our experimental surveys, we did 4 experiments in 3 studies. The first study was we encouraged people to search for evidence. So we want to see if going out and searching for evidence improves respondents' ability to tell true from fake. The second one, we paid people more if they got the answer correct. And the third one, we did a sort of 2x2 varying whether or not we gave people the source of the article and whether or not we gave them just the headline, as opposed to what we were normally doing was sending them out to the article where they would have the full text of the article and the headline. So we did this 2x2, seeing what would happen if we had just the source, if we varied whether or not they had the source, and what would happen if we gave them just the headline as opposed to the whole story. Now, this is the process I told you about a minute ago, so I'll go through this quickly. The article sampling, we think this is an important innovation in studying false news or studying people's ability to assess the veracity of news. What we call this transparent replicable process. And as I said before, we got 2 articles from mainstream news sources. Those were taken, we used CrowdTangle, which is a tool that you guys can use as well by dint of being a Knight Research Center. And then we also used for our suspect news sources, we used the pre-existing list, so we didn't choose the list from Alcott et al. And then we sort of we coded them ourselves as false news, whether they seem to be left-leaning, whether they seem to be right-leaning, or whether they seem to be mainstream. Okay. All right. Yeah. In terms of, I see the comment about whether or not the New York Times is a left-leaning publication. We have a transparent automated process by which we separated these into sort of left of center or right of center on the spectrum of political. We could redo that. So yeah, this is not meant to be a normative statement here. All right, so these are examples of true news services. And as I'll show you in a second, our designation of right-leaning and left-leaning in terms of mainstream news ends up making very little difference about anything, but it did ensure we had sufficient variation in terms of news sources. So these are some examples of true news stories. Interestingly enough, Kanye West calling himself the greatest artist that God has ever created. That was a true statement, that Kanye West did call himself the greatest artist that God has ever created. Whether we're not weighing in on whether Kanye West is the greatest artist that God has ever created. And Donald Trump Jr. did indeed actually kill a rare endangered sheep in Mongolia with a special permit. Here's some examples of things that were coded as misleading or fake news. There was stuff related. We were doing this, it's hard to imagine this, but this is pre the pandemic. Although at the very end, we got a few pandemic related articles, all of which are not on, the ones are not on the screen, but they all had to do with whether or not this was deliberately, the virus was deliberately engineered in a Chinese factory as a bioweapon. But these are some examples of things that we got that were rated false or misleading. Now, I want to say a word on ground truth right now, and this is what I'm going to come back to at the end of the talk, because we're thinking a lot about this. For today's presentation, I am going to use as the ground truth. So when I say whether someone got it correct or wrong, the ground truth is going to be the mode of the professional fact checkers. This is what we pre-registered in our pre-analysis plan. But it's not, of course, the only way that you could come up with ground truth of professional fact checkers. And one of the things that we were surprised about was, especially as we get into some of the false and misleading stuff, was the degree of disagreement among some of the crowd professional fact checkers as we get, especially across these three different categories. So at the end of the talk, I'm going to come back, and I love your feedback on and your responses on and your thoughts on different ways that we can think about testing the robustness of our conclusions with other measures of ground truth. But I do want to make it clear right now that for now, when we say if you got it right and what the ground truth is, this is the mode of the professional fact checkers. So most days we got all 6 of our professional fact checkers wrote back to us. Some days only 5 of them did. When I say the correct answer here, it's the mode of the professional fact checkers. When we talk about the veracity scale, then that'll just be the average of the professional fact checkers. That's much simpler. All right, so again, article designations. Articles can therefore be the correct answer. The mode of the professional fact checkers can either be true, false or misleading, or could not determine based on the fact checker evaluations. And the articles can come from either mainstream news sources or these false news sources, or we can call them suspect news sources. And then one thing to just tell you now, going back to the point I made before, pretty much all of the articles from mainstream news sources were found to be true by the fact checkers. So our mainstream news sources here serves as a useful control, but in all of these cases, pretty much with one exception of one article, we found that the mainstream news sources, anything that came from the mainstream news sources, our professional fact checkers rated as true. All right, so what makes this study different from other things that people have done previously about individual level ability to identify the veracity of news sources? There are 2 very kind of innovative aspects of this. One is that we are doing this in real time. So we built this pipeline so we could send this out and we could analyze, and we could have these stories being analyzed in the first 24 hours that they appeared. We think this is crucial for a couple of different reasons. First of all, this is before Snopes and PolitiFact and these sorts of things have weighed in on studies. So this is going to be assessing people's ability to do this without these professional, with these fact-checking organizations that have already weighed in on things. Second, we think this is how people often encounter news in the earliest days of it. And third, looking way down the tree, if we are going to use the signal that these crowdsourcing fact-checkers can provide us with to reduce the amount of false information in the overall information ecosystem, we would want to intervene quickly as opposed to later before it is spread widely. And so having a sense of what happens if we can do this in the first 24 hours that news stories from policy perspectives are super important. But we also think from a sort of pure science thing, this is our best way to balance external validity with really seeing the extent to which people, when they're first given access to these articles, that they can identify the veracity of them. The second thing is this question of by having this pipeline where we pull out the news stories automatically, we're not just selecting things in retrospect that went particularly viral. We're going to capture a lot of stories that aren't actually particularly viral. We capture plenty of stories in this design that are actually true. And we're not introducing researcher bias into the selection of news stories. And we think some of the things that might be interesting about our results are that we have more complicated stories in here than researchers might normally choose if they were choosing a story to evaluate. So we think it adds a strong degree of external validity to what we're doing. All right, so the first research question, now I'm going to walk you through results. Can individuals distinguish between true and false news in real time? So first I'm going to focus on the categorical. So this is the ground, we're giving ground truth based on the fact checkers is either true, false, or misleading, could not determine. How well do people do? All right, so this is across our entire study. Basically, people are not great at identifying the articles that our professional fact checkers have rated as false or misleading. They do okay at identifying the true stories. So things that the ground truth says are true, about 67% of our respondents categorize those as true. But for things that our professional fact checkers determine are false or misleading, only about a third of our respondents, and this is across the entire study, have classified those as false or misleading. Here's the breakdown by true articles. It's less worrisome. I mean, it depends what you define. It depends what your baseline is for being worrisome, right? What we see is whereas 2/3 of them are actually kind of getting it right, that they are at identifying the true articles as true. Only about 15% of them are thinking that true news is actually false. And the rest are in this kind of could not determine category. When we look at the false or misleading articles, it's a much different situation. Basically, for things that our professional fact checkers have ascertained are false or misleading, we have only about, as I showed you a minute ago, only a third of people correctly classify them as false or misleading. But even more troublesome, a third of the people incorrectly classify them as true. And then about a third say could not determine. Now, very interestingly, source matters, right? When we look at things that are true from mainstream sources, people are over 75% of the people are getting the correct answer of saying that these are true. When we look at true from these suspect sources, about 50% of our crowd is getting it right. And when we look at the false news, which I showed you before, from the fake sources, it's about a third getting it right. So the source is mattering here is one of the things that here. All right, but what about at the article level? Are there some fake news? I'm just showing you at the individual level. Are there some fake news articles where the majority of respondents are right, or are respondents as a group rating most fake news articles incorrectly? And what we found is that even when we look at the article level, again, these are our articles that our professional fact checkers have rated as false or misleading. We don't find a single article where 50% or more of respondents actually identifies it correctly as false or misleading. All right, so what about the veracity scale? This is just to show a totally kind of different way of measuring it. On the veracity scale, how would you rate this article? This is from 1 to 7, definitely not true. And the veracity scale kind of looks good overall. It looks a lot better than the categorical scale. We have a correlation of about 0.8. But we're concerned about this because this seems to be a quirk of the data that's driven by the source. So if you look at just mainstream news, both respondents and fact checkers rate mainstream news highly. So that's actually pulling this correlation a lot better. But it's a fairly weak correlation within mainstream news. It's still positive, but it's not particularly strong. But when you look at just the fake news sources, right, you're getting a much sort of weaker correlation here. And you're seeing a sort of correlation around the 0.6 level of the fact checkers on fake news source articles. So the key takeaways for our first research question is, respondents are good at identifying true news from mainstream news sources, which is good. And actually, in the context of the pandemic, it's kind of really good if this extends to science-related information as well, because it suggests there's a pretty good vehicle for getting information out to the public that the public will trust and think is true. However, the respondents are not very good at distinguishing between true and false misleading news from these false news sources. And also, respondents tend to trust fake news more than fact checkers, and they tend to trust fake mainstream news less, which is buried in those veracity tables. All right, so now let's move on to the next question. Who gets it right? Who is most likely to agree with the ground truth from the fact checkers? And I'm going to show you this at a sort of just a correlational level, and then I'll show you based on the experiments that we ran. So let's begin with the demographics. I'm going to group these into kind of three categories. I'm not going to show you the middle one just for the sake of time. I'm not going to show you figures, but we have those as well. I'm going to start with the two interesting ones, education and age, based on prior research. And what's interesting about that is that education doesn't seem to matter past a threshold of high school education, and age surprisingly doesn't matter. Then there's a group of variables that we found, which are all the kind of like having more of a sense of what's going on in politics and news. So political knowledge, trust in institutions, digital literacy, news consumption, these all have slightly positive impacts. But the most important, that seems to have the biggest effect, is going to be ideological concordance. So let me walk you through this. So what we have on the x-axis here is the proportion that agree with our fact checkers. On the left, it's for all news. On the right, it's for fake news. And what we find is there's not a huge education effect. There is a difference between people with less than high school education, although we have fewer of those in the sample, so we have a sort of larger error bar around that. And people, once you kind of have a high school education and a certainly, you know, it seems to be fairly close on all news. With correctly identifying the fake news, you know, a college education seems to matter a little bit more too. And again, we see this less than high school education. Surprisingly, for some of you who might be familiar with previous research that's come out of this map lab, we were quite surprised to see that actually people aged, there doesn't seem to be an age effect at all. And that actually put some of our earlier findings about showing that in the 2016 elections, that people who were older than age 65 on average shared 7 times as many links to fake news websites than millennials did. It kind of puts it in a new light. Well, not quite. I mean, we talk about different explanations in that paper, but it suggests that the issue is not that people over the age of 65 are actually having trouble figuring out the veracity of news. There may be other things behind why they're sharing it more. But so this was a very interesting and surprising, somewhat surprising finding to us, but very illuminative. Okay, so now we're going to get into the second research question. Are there large differences, partisan differences in performance? And here is, I mean, this is one of the really important things about thinking about partisanship and partisan concordance. So this is ideology, right? And if it turns out, if you look at ideology, your sort of first thing is, okay, liberals are a bit better than conservatives at this. But this can be a function of the sample where we have a larger supply of things that are rated as false or misleading by our fact checkers that come from the right side or right-leaning ideology. And this is the kind of key takeaway graph. And this is by far the biggest effect we find along any of these demographic variables that we had said we wanted to check, which is that if it's from the conservative sources, right, and which is rated, and this was, you know, we broke down these sort of sources, these suspect false news sources online into conservative and liberal, conservative leaning and liberal leaning. If it's from a conservative source, then liberals, if you look over here, are quite good at identifying false or misleading news correctly. This is just our, you know, conservative sources, and these are things that our fact checkers from conservative sources rated false or misleading. We had fewer from liberal sources that were rated false or misleading, but these are almost completely symmetrical graphs. I mean, it's just kind of quite striking. You start with extreme liberals and go down to liberals, and they are, you know, much better at correctly identifying conservative leaning false news as being false or misleading. And then it's the exact opposite for the conservatives. When it's a liberal from a liberal leaning source that our fact checkers rank as fact or misleading, then the conservatives are quite good at identifying it as false or misleading. So there is a big partisan effect that is seeping through individual level assessment of the veracity of news. And this fits with a sort of long line of motivated reasoning research that's been around for decades now in the political science literature. But it is, you know, but what we're finding here is a sort of stark level of this shining through in this task of being able to identify whether stuff is false or misleading. It also matters in what we call susceptibility to fake news. So this is the proportion of people who will call fake news true, things that our fact checkers have said is false or misleading, and they will label it as true. And we see the same thing among the conservatives. We see the effect is slightly less for susceptibility to false news among the liberals, but not that much. Okay, so the general findings, a wide array of characteristics matter when matching with fact checkers, and liberals and conservatives both exhibit large and similar biases when evaluating the veracity of news. All right, so the third research question, what makes people better or worse at this task? And here was where we tried these kind of 4 different interventions to see if that would help. So the interventions are going to be, our first experiment was we asked people to search online for the answers. Now, in our original study, people could be searching online. We didn't prohibit them from searching online, but we didn't ask them to do it. And since we were paying people to take these studies, our assumption is most of them were not spending longer than they needed to. In the new one, in the experiment, we had people and encouraged them to go out and search online for information and did some things to try to make them do that. The second experiment, we paid people for getting the answer correct. And then in the third experiment, we varied giving, in our normal study, we give everybody the full text of the article. In a experimental treatment, we saw what happened if we gave them the headline just of the article and the blurb instead of the full text. And then also in the third experiment, we made it 2 by 2, we varied whether or not we told them the source. So for the experimental group, they got the same information, but it was without the source. So they weren't actually clicking on a URL to go to it. They were just taken to a page where they could see this information. All right, so this is the sort of, this is the most troubling finding probably that we have in the study, although maybe the partisanship one deserves that thing, but also kind of surprising given what one would normally think. So the first thing is the treatment group is asked to search online for information, given some instructions on how to do that, and given some ideas about, some ways to try to make sure they're doing it. All right. Does this help identify fake news? No, false news. It actually turns out to be just the opposite. So does searching for information help people identify false or misleading articles? Here's the sort of finding. I mean, they're fairly close to each other, but people who were not asked to go online and search for false or misleading news actually matched our fact checkers on these articles a larger proportion of the time than the people we asked to go online and search for this information. But what this is covering, we can dig a little deeper into this. And what we find is something that I've talked to social psychologists about this, who there's something called a truth bias, that human beings have this bias toward truth. And what we think is happening is the action of going to search for information is activating this kind of truth bias. So this is for the true articles. So this is the articles that our fact checkers rated as true. And we found that actually when people went out and searched for information on the fact checking true, they were more likely to match the true condition. However, so that would be good, right? Like on true articles, searching for information is helping people. However, the same thing happened with our false or misleading articles. So when we told people to go out and look on the internet for information, more people were likely to say that the false or misleading articles were true than when we didn't ask people to go out and search for information. So what we suspect might be happening is that people are typing these headlines into Google. They're finding things popping up that are maybe somewhat similar. Maybe these are recycled from other stories that have been out there before, but there's something about this activity of going and searching for information. One of the things we've done in this study that I haven't talked about yet is we actually have collected, every time when we enter an article into our study, every hour we do a Google search with that article as the headline, as the search, and we record what comes back. So down the road, we could actually look into this in more detail and see what those Google searches were recording. But this seems to be what's going on, is that going out and looking for information is making you more likely to say things are true, which is having this net effect of decreasing your ability, decreasing the group's ability to get things right on these false or misleading articles. Not the group, individuals at this point. We can also see this in the veracity scale. When you go out and ask, if you just look at this graphically, you can see there are more dots above the 0 line than there are below it. This is what we're measuring here, is the change in the veracity scale by article between the people who were in the control group versus the people in the treatment group who were asked to go search for information. And searching for information does make you more likely to increase your level of veracity in it, regardless, unfortunately, of whether it comes from, whether it's one of these false or misleading articles. And in fact, you can see all the X's there. Those are all cases where our fact checkers rank them as false or misleading. And every one of those X's that's above the 0 is, in our treatment, more people thought it was more true than thought it was less true from going out there. All right, what about paying for a correct answer? There's some interesting social science literature around political knowledge questions, and there's been a lot of take about how, people on the left and people on the right have, radically different beliefs about true facts. But then if you pay them to get the answer, some of those differences seem to go away pretty quickly. So we were optimistic about this, especially for the ideological bias, that it might reduce ideological bias. So does it help to identify fake news? No, that's just the bottom line. Our control and our treatment group look exactly the same in terms of the people who correctly identify the false or misleading articles. Does it reduce the ideological bias? It did a little bit, somewhat. So if you look here, for conservative articles that were rated false or misleading, conservatives were slightly more likely to get the answer correct when they were paid than they were when they weren't paid. And if we look at liberals, on liberal articles rated false or misleading, liberals were a bit more likely to get it correct when we paid them to get the correct answer than when we didn't pay them to get the correct answer. There are these kind of bizarre findings, but they're fairly small, that suggest that this happens in the opposite direction, which kind of makes no sense whatsoever. But for the people who were concerned about the bias, conservatives rating conservative false or misleading articles and liberals rating liberal false or misleading articles. I mean, these levels are still atrocious, right? Like they're still, like, at the best case scenario, we've moved liberals from, slightly under 20% of the time to slightly around 30% of the time matching on these questions. All right. But overall, and again, this is a great sort of example of a kind of null result. Payment doesn't really seem to have much effect. You see how much more bunch this is around the 0 line. Although again, if anything, if you look at these X or these false misleading, when we were paying people to get the right answer, they were increasing their veracity scores a little bit too, which seems troubling. Okay, the final experiment we did was this 2x2 experiment, where we looked at varying whether or not we gave people the full text, which is what so this here, full text with the source, article on website, this is everything I've shown you so far. So this is the sort of control group for the rest of the study. This is what our main study is. So we varied it by giving people the full text without the source, and we varied it by giving them only headlines as opposed to the whole article. When we gave them the source, we kept the banner in there while we gave them the headline and the lead. When we didn't give them the source, this was just like, we would just give them a headline and lead in a standardized font, and this was the full text in a standardized format. So for the first one, if we want to look at the difference between the full text versus just having the headline and lead, we're looking at the difference between this column and this column. And this is what the headline and lead looks like that they would get if they got the source version of it. This is the headline and lead version of it if they didn't get the source version of it. All right, does only giving people the headline help fact checkers? No, not really. Not surprisingly, when we only gave people the headline, they did slightly worse about in terms of agreeing with our professional fact checkers, and that held whether or not we gave them the source or not. This is the level of the change in the veracity scores between the case, so it's a sort of similar finding. When we look at for full headline, when we look at source versus no source, so this is now comparing the difference between getting the source, either with the headline and the lead, or what we've been giving people already, the article, versus the sort of full text and the standardized version of it, so no source. So this would be comparing, for example, source versus no source now would be comparing for the just the headline and lead. It would be comparing this version of the headline and the lead versus this headline and lead. And what we find with source versus no source, we don't actually find that much difference on all articles when they have the full text. We do find that when we didn't give people the source, they did slightly better when we just gave them the headline. And when we look across the full articles, when we include the we don't give them the source, when we go from not giving them the source, change of veracity source from source exclusion, excluding the source, without the source, people are agreeing, or their veracity scores are going up a little bit more, which is suggesting that perhaps, especially for these false or misleading articles, having the source and seeing that it's a source that's, from these non-mainstream sources may be helping people. So people may be queuing a bit off the source, which kind of loops back to the finding we found earlier in the beginning of the talk loops back to the finding we found earlier in the beginning of the talk about the importance of the mainstream news and how people were more likely to agree with the mainstream news sources. All right, so the finding from experiments are searching for information increases, these are the key takeaways. Searching for information increases the likelihood that individuals believe the false or misleading news, as well as increasing the likelihood that individuals believe the true news. So we think it fits in with this truth bias idea. Paying individuals for correct answers does not increase the likelihood that individuals correctly identify the misleading false news, but it might mitigate a little ideological bias. And showing only headlines decreases the likelihood that the individuals match the fact checkers. Okay, so that's been a lot of findings about kind of basic science on this question of how are individuals able to identify the veracity of news stories in real time. Part of why we started doing this, oh, I see there's a comment. Chat. Yeah. All right. So we also get a question about why is it surprising that fact checkers are ineffective? Yes, that's a good question. I'll leave it to you to have what your priors were on the particular issues of it. So surprising, I don't want to weigh in on whether it's surprising or not. That's in the eye of the beholder. All right. So but this is all kind of leading up to this question of can the crowd fact check news in real time? And this was part of why we were doing this, was trying to figure out, can we build crowdsourcing? Can we build models from crowds that would generate valuable signal for newly appearing articles as to whether those articles would likely be rated by professional fact checkers as false or true, or ultimately whether they're false or true. All right, so why might we be thinking about this, right? Well, there's in the literature and psychology, management science, there's a whole bunch of things that the crowd has been shown to be kind of good at. And this goes back sort of a long time in history and this kind of wisdom of the crowds. And there's also this finding from Pennycook and Rand that the crowd, much to the surprise of a lot of people, was actually pretty good at distinguishing between lower and higher quality news sources, which is this graph here on the side, that people who were more left-wing and more right-wing, they liked what you might think they might like better, but everybody knew that the sort of mainstream news sources were to be trusted more than some of these, some of the suspect news sources. So at the site level, the crowd seems to have done pretty good on this particular topic. And then there's this whole history of sort of crowds being able to do these sorts of things. So let me show you a little bit of kind of where we're going in terms of this type of analysis. And I'm going to show you results from, as I said, from the where we are right now in terms of ground truth. And we're going to use the simplest rule possible here in these figures to determine what the crowd says. So right now we're using, again, the same as everything I've shown you before. The mode of the fact checkers is considered the ground truth, the correct answer. And then the crowd is going to be measured on the same way, the mode of the crowd. And what you see on this figure is we varied the crowd size from 3 to 30. And the nice thing is, because we have 90 people who've coded every chart, we can sample as many crowds as we want, as many different variations of crowds of 3 people, to see how crowds of 3 people do over 10,000 simulations. And we can do the same thing going up to crowds of 30. We could do it going up higher. This is the percent of our crowds across our entire study that correctly matches the fact checkers. So we see when our crowds are small, you know, it's quite low. It's less around a third. But as we get up to about 10 people in the crowd, we're getting to the point where the crowds are correctly matching the fact checkers, you know, over half the time. The problem is that of these people who are matching the fact checkers, this is really distinguished by whether or not the article was rated true by the fact checkers or whether the article was rated false or misleading. And as we know, when the articles were rated true, people did better job matching it, and they did enough better that for the true articles, we kind of, you know, quickly get up to about 75% of our crowds match the fact checkers. But for the false or misleading articles, we're stuck actually below the level that individuals are doing. If you just do the math in your head, if individuals are only getting this right a third of the time, crowds voting as a whole are only getting this right, as it turns out, about 25% of the time. But as I said, this is the sort of most naive way we could do this. And when we look at the difference between the fake news sources and the mainstream news sources, what we find is for the mainstream news sources, the crowds, you get a crowd of up to about, you know, 10 or 15 people, and there the mode is matching over 80% of the time. But again, for the false, for what we called our sort of suspect news sources, this is much lower. All right, so let me quickly distinguish. Let me quickly go back to our first original research questions to wrap this up. Can individuals distinguish between true and false news? No. We see a big problem when news was rated false or misleading. People have a lot of trouble with this. What makes people better or worse at this task? Things like more political knowledge, more institutional trust, more digital literacy makes things better. Are there large partisan differences in performance? Yes, but it's based on partisan congruence with ideology for the source of the false news. What can we do to improve performance? Paradoxically, don't ask people to search for confirmation seems to be better for identifying false or misleading news. Paying people reduces ideological bias. Can fact-checking news be crowdsourced? It's still too early to say that. There's some early reasons from what I've showed you with these most naive models to be concerned about the ability to do this, but there's a lot more we can do, and that's what I want to talk about right now. So one of the things that we've been pushed on after presenting early results from this is the question that by getting the mode of the fact-checkers, are we obscuring the fact that there are articles out there that fact-checkers have trouble getting the right answer for? And so is that somehow biasing our ability of individuals to get the correct answer because these are just really hard things that by saying the mode, well, maybe the mode isn't the correct answer in some cases. So currently we're using the mode. That's what we pre-registered. That's when we designed the study. What we thought of was by far going to be the best way to get the ground truth out of this. And what we thought was we would have a lot of things where it was like 5-to-1 or maybe 4-to-1-to-1 or something like that. But it turns out there are some cases in these false news stories where if we changed the rating of just one fact checker, it would change what was the mode. So we've also come up with this alternative method that we call the robust mode, which is we only code it as false if changing one person, any one of the fact checkers, wouldn't change what the mode was. And we could do a robust true as well, the same thing. We would only code it as true if changing one of the fact checkers wouldn't change that categorization. So that's an alternative way that would give us a sort of more robust version of this ground truth. But it does have the problem that it will kick some things where the modal fact checker said it was false, it would kick that out of our false category. Another way we thought about thinking of this is that instead of looking at the mode of these three categories, we just say, look, for the ones that we're worried about, the ones that we think are false or suspect, let's in a sense kind of combine the could not determine and the false category and say, look, as long as nobody said it was true, then our ground truth will be that that article is false or misleading, or vice versa. As long as nobody said it was false, our ground truth will be that that article was true. That's going to lead to that's going to lead to a different set of categories. So it would be alt2 would be like, the mode of it would still have to be false. But then if somebody said it was true, we wouldn't include it in our false group in seeing how well people do with false information. All right. Then we have this kind of any of the first three articles where if it matches for any of these categories, we would code it as false. That would lead to the most articles being coded as false because the no true one doesn't have to include it in the mode. It would just have to include it as nobody said it was true. So that would lead the most coders as false, or then we could have the sort of most robust way of thinking about this, or the sort of most demanding way, is that it's got to meet all of these four categories. It has to be a robust mode, and nobody could have said it was true for it to be counted as false. So that's what we're thinking about now. I'm totally interested in your feedback and your thoughts in that regard. If you're concerned about this, if there are other things we should be thinking about here, but this was one of our surprises that some of these things that we have coded as false or misleading, that these there's less consistency among the fact checkers than we would have thought. Now on the crowdsourcing, I also told you we use the most naive way of coding what the crowd says, right? And since this is a signal extraction problem, we want to get signal out of the crowd, we want to think about lots of different ways that we could extract signal in different ways that might be more helpful. So our current version is we're using the mode of the crowd. What we're now looking at is some alternate ways we can use the crowd. So one was to remove could not determine, to just say like, let's get rid of the people in the crowd who said they couldn't determine, we'll take them out of it. And then we take the mode of the remaining two, true or false or misleading. right? That would be an alternative to saying it has to be the mode of the crowd, because right now the mode of the crowd sometimes is could not determine. So this is, we remove the people who can't determine, and then we essentially, then the crowd will say that everything is either false or misleading, or it's true, unless there's not a majority, unless there's a tie between those two. The second option we could do for the crowd is that we could count the could not determine category. We could say, all right, people are only going to say could not determine if there's something problematic about the news. And so we could then just sort of bounce the could not determine category for the crowd into the false or misleading category. So in that case, we would say the crowd is saying that the article is true only if a majority of the crowd says the article is true. Otherwise, we say the crowd is sending a signal that there's something suspicious about this particular article. So that's a second way to do voting rules. Then we're also playing around with altering the way we sample from our reviewers. So right now we're just sampling. When I showed you a crowd of 3 people, we were just sampling a random draw from the crowd. So our first thought in this regard is, well, knowing that there's this partisanship bias, we could, instead of sampling a random draw from the crowd, we could sample partisan bias crowds. So we know people self-reported conservative, liberal, and independent. We could draw crowds that have 1 conservative, 1 liberal, and 1 independent in them, and see if those crowds do a better job of matching the professional fact checkers. And then the third thing, which I haven't even gotten into here, is that of course we can use machine learning models on this, and we're going to be doing this moving forward. And we've started playing around with that now, but I didn't want to, it's still quite preliminary. I will just say, going to machine learning models over simple voting rules, our initial aspects of this has been, not surprisingly, that they perform a lot better, and that we're more optimistic that the machine learning models are going to actually be matching the professional fact checkers more often. However, the downside of machine learning models is that if we were going to try to push anyone to implement this as policy, it's much, much easier to explain to the public from a policy perspective a simple rule. We take the mode of the crowd. These crowds are composed of 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, and 1 thing, and we take the mode from that group. Explaining what's going on in the background of a machine learning model, is a lot harder to explain. And we know there's a lot of concern about black box methods that are used by platforms, to do all sorts of content moderation and things like that. So we're exploring all of those things. And then the third thing that we're going to be doing that's new is that we are, pending funding that we're cautiously optimistic about at the moment, we are going to be doing, taking this whole apparatus that we built up to look at this question of misinformation, and we're going to reorient it to look at things about COVID-19. So the first thing we're going to do, starting perhaps as early as next week, is we're going to restart this whole apparatus again, but we're going to do, for the first month, 2 days a week, we're going to go out and we're going to only do COVID-19 articles. So when we go to our 5 streams, we're going to look at the most popular article. If it's related to the pandemic, we'll do it. If it's not related to the pandemic, we'll go to the next one and then find the first one that's related to the pandemic. And then, and this is pending the funding part, our plan is to do this through the entire election season. And so in the second study, what we would do is we would do 1 day a week, we would do this COVID-19 only category. And the second day a week, we'd go back to our normal thing of just pulling the most popular article, which will turn out to be COVID-19 related in lots of the cases anyway. But then we would do this throughout the entire election campaign and see if, as more people stop socially isolating at home, if social media levels go down, do some of these things change, and then see if shocks during the election campaign interact with people's ability to identify information. And we suspect that in the aftermath of this election, there's going to be all sorts of false and misleading information entered into the ecosystem, probably about the election and the veracity of the election results and things like that. And so we would be in place to capture all of that. So those are the next steps. And then finally, the last thing I'll just say is sort of just to give you a sense of where we're going with this in terms of, I've showed you bits and pieces of a larger study, the sort of 4 planned papers at this point, all of which are in progress right now, is individual level analysis of susceptibility to false news. So a lot of what I've showed you here today, but really focusing on this question of who codes these articles that the professional fact checkers label as false, who's coding them as true, who thinks they're true. The second is, can we use crowdsourcing to provide valuable signals as to what a team of professional fact checkers would likely say is true, false, or news? Then the third thing, which we're incredibly excited about, but it's going to take a lot longer because it's sort of dependent on finishing the second, but we're starting on this, is can we use crowdsourcing signal to decrease overall levels of false or misleading news in the information ecosystem? And this would be a kind of epidemiological agent-based model type paper. But we've been collecting, and I haven't even told you about all this, we've been collecting all this information about the spread of all of the news stories in our study. So we were going to be able to do set up agent-based models with spreads that actually mimic what was the real spread of this information in life, and then real crowds that we can draw upon. So we could say in the agent-based model, if say we were able to suppress the spread of an article by 75%, if our crowd used this rule, we could then see, based on these real crowds that we have, how often that would end up suppressing true news and how often that would end up suppressing false or misleading news. And then we can set these rates of spread based on how the articles actually spread in the real world, because we've been tracking all of that. So we're very, very excited about that, but that's going to be a little bit farther. And then this thing that's come up that we hadn't expected, we're now doing an assessment of the variability of the professional fact checker consistency. And one of the things that I also haven't talked to you about today is that we went out to professional fact checkers, a new set of professional fact checkers 3 months later, to try to get a sense of the extent to which this variation in what the professional fact checkers are saying may or may not have been due to the fact that we asked them to do this in the first 24 hours also, or whether this is just inherent in the enterprise. And I think, and Kevin can speak to this, but I think the very preliminary results on that is that there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of difference 3 months later among the professional fact checkers as there was originally. All right, so I'm now done. We've got a little bit of time for question and answer. Thanks very much for your patience, and it's been a pleasure sharing this information. I look forward to answering your questions. So I'll hand it over to Jeremy, and you can moderate however you'd like.
It looks like we have one question from Jeffrey. Have you thought, it's in the chat, have you thought about looking at the time history of news items to determine true versus false content? For example,
Jeffrey, do you want to elaborate on that? Oh, like looking at what do you mean by looking at the time history?
I mute myself. Hi. Yeah. Well, I'm new to this community. I'm actually looked into this a lot while I was a program manager at DARPA.
Okay.
So, and I reached out to these folks. We didn't get a program started in this, although there are some folks who are pursuing that area. It seems like you're looking at a particular snapshot of finding, and it's an interesting. I mean, getting a real-time fact-checking capability would certainly be useful that people could use. So, I mean, in terms of the goal. But it seems like you're looking at individual snapshots of presenting articles to folks, and this article that attracted our attention at the time by Deb Roy at MIT Media Lab had and his postdoc, who's I think he's now at Dartmouth actually, Sarush Vasugi, was looking at the time history. A lot of these, so that you could find, detect the fake news before it hits the mainstream. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that is fake, that's not trivially fake, like not obviously fake, has some truth in it. I mean, it's maligned information campaigns, and it starts in offline, Reddit, 8chan, whatever the heck it's called, 4chan, whatever it is. I mean, it starts way before that. And if you could find the content and find that seed, then, we started to look at that. And I just wonder if you're in this business, whether you're
I think that. As I said, that's the point of this third paper, because we have now, for every one of the articles in our sample, we have the spread, how it spread on Reddit, how it spread on Twitter, I don't know about Reddit, but Twitter, we have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We've looked at all, we're collecting this data about how it spread. So the idea of this would be like, right, so if we can get that, if we can know how these things spread down the road, is our data would allow us to model what interventions look like, what interventions might do to that spread if they came early on in the process. And the question here is that, can we actually, what is the concept? We're going to get some stuff wrong if we do it early on in the process, right? But so from that time perspective, that's like where I see our work fitting into this. Like, could we go to ordinary people who you give a few bucks to look at a few articles and, just tell you their sense of the veracity of those articles in the first few days, and actually reduce, based on what we know about that long-term spread, actually reduce the ability. Now, we're not looking because our interest is in what happens in the first 24 hours, we haven't looked at the data to see, could we, ex post have identified the false news based on their patterns of spread in the first. I mean, the problem with, if you're really good at identifying false information based on their patterns of spread over 3 months, then by the time you run that on things that are 3 months old, they've already spread all over the place. So the trick would be, could you do it earlier on? We can actually use our data to look at that. We haven't done that yet.
Thanks.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, that's why we're excited about this. Like, we feel like most of what we had known previously about people's ability to identify false and misleading information came from articles that, were chosen by scholars to put in studies that had already been out there for a long time. And that ultimately, if you want to build a sort of apparatus out of this, the best time to do it is going to be really early on. So is that feasible at all? Other questions?
Looks like, I'm sorry, but your name, a senior. Do you have your hand up?
Hi, my name is Ayşe Nur. Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Tucker. It was really interesting. I'm a PhD student in Syracuse University, and I'm interested in these studies. So I have 2 questions. The first one is about the finding that age didn't matter in identifying false news,
Right.
fake news. And I'm familiar with the study you mentioned about the age, the effect of age
Right.
in sharing the fake news. You actually presented in Koç University, and I was there.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah, we met there. So I was very surprised to see that age didn't affect identifying fake news. Can it be about the? I mean, can it be about the confidence that older people might have in sharing something online? And I think this is also about the digital literacy, which connects to my second question. So when searching for news for evidence doesn't decrease the likelihood of false identifying in news, I think. So this is about the digital literacy, right? So,
Right.
But the question is how to identify a fake news based on evidence, because like a Google search results in the other links that shares the same article. So there is an availability bias as well. So I'm not sure like how to improve digital literacy in that. Like, what would your opinions on this would be?
Right. Yeah, so I just want to pull up. So, okay, yeah, I'll just answer the things. I'm going to slide that and pull up. But so let me answer the first of those 2 things. Right. So if you read the original paper that we wrote about the sharing of fake news on Facebook in 2016, we said that the Occam's razor explanation for this, the simplest explanation, is digital literacy. Right. I tell my mom to get on Facebook to see pictures of her grandchildren. She gets on Facebook, and at 2016, the New York Times and the Denver Guardian are both like a headline, a picture, and a blurb. Only the New York Times is the New York Times, and the Denver Guardian doesn't exist, right? And so that was the Occam's razor explanation. But we do mention in that paper, and I'm sure I brought up in the talk at Coach, right, that there are alternative explanations for this, right? One might be that this is identity signaling, right? That people are sharing these fake news stories as, I have to say with that study, I've never gotten so many, anecdotal comments from people when I present it to people. And one of the ones that resonated with me was what a scholar, when I was presenting it once, was saying she kept sending her mother Snopes articles and saying, this isn't true, this isn't true. And the mother finally wrote back and said, I don't care if it's true. I just want my friends to know I hate Hillary Clinton, right? And so if it's that kind of identity sharing, right, that would be a different reason why people share fake news. And in the sense that there'd be different reason why people share fake news if it's this kind of identity sharing. Then in order to have that explain our results that we found in the Science Advances paper, it would have to somehow be correlated with age. And you've mentioned one thing, like older people might just be more confident in their opinions. They may want to engage more in terms of this signaling activity, signaling their identity. Other people have brought up that it's costly for people who are still in the job force or the job market to be sort of vehemently in public sharing this fake stuff just to signify their identity. So there might be something about that. So we went into this study, which is designed for totally different purposes. I was very, very interested in that age finding. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time we've ever had a study where we've been able to say, all right, based on that first Science Advances study, if it was the digital literacy, we should expect that these older people would be worse at identifying. We should expect that these people would be worse at identifying the veracity of these news stories. And in particular, we should expect that older people would think that false news was true more often. The fact that they didn't, to me, signifies, and I got to say, I've been pushing this since the get-go because I think that there may be different explanations besides digital literacy. The fact that they didn't is, to me, really interesting because it suggests some of these alternative explanations that aren't the simplest explanation might have been behind the findings that we had previously. And I'm just now, but the one thing I will say that cuts against that is that, and I'm trying to pull up this slide really quickly, is that, do we have this? Yeah, okay, so here is the one thing that cuts against this, which I'll just show really fast, is that digital literacy does predict higher levels of concordance with fact checkers. This was part of this series of different variables. We also looked at like trust in institutions, political knowledge, news consumption, anything that we were kind of getting at, like how familiar are you with stuff, be it politics, be it news, be it the internet, that kind of thing. The more familiar you were, the better you do on this, right? It's not nearly as dramatic an effect as we found for the co-partisanship finding, but it is an effect. So if it really was that digital literacy had nothing to do with the sharing of fake news, you might have expected this to be totally flat. So we have a little bit of contradictory evidence here. We have old people are not worse at this task than younger people. Now, the one other thing we have to say here, and this is, we have some other work about this thing. These are people who are taking internet surveys. Now, we did this through Qualtrics. This isn't like just this isn't mTurkers or anything like that. If I showed you this with the mTurk, I'd be very concerned about it. But nevertheless, Qualtrics seeks to have representative samples of the population on whole lots of levels. That being said, these were still people who were able to take an internet survey. That being said, people who are on Facebook are still people who know how to use Facebook. So whether you think those are different levels of things there. All right, so I see we're running over the designated time, so I want to stop. I could talk more about this, but let me, are there any other questions that I haven't had a chance to get to?
It looks like Aaliyah has her hand up.
Hey. Hi, Alia, we can't hear you. Do you want to type in the chat? Or we can follow up later if you want. Alia is a student at NYU Abu Dhabi who has been an undergraduate research associate of our SMAP lab. So again, showing the value of these virtual online fora for presenting work.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Josh. That was a great talk, and I'm sure we're all extremely appreciative both of the research and of sharing it with us. For the rest of you, stay tuned. We'll have another talk in the series next month. Meanwhile, as a point of announcement for the group, the CASO seminar series will be, Summer Institute will be going on as a remote training session. It will be happening in June. The second thing is that I want to remind you we have the Social Cybersecurity webpage where we have links to various events, but also have links to the various people in this area, and so please and links to various tools and so on. And and it actually points to some of the SNAP tools. So please, if there's things that are missing from there that you want to see there, please let me know and we will get them up. So thank you all again, and stay safe and healthy.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks all of you for your time. And, you know, keep an eye out. We'll have these drafts of papers coming in the coming months on all of this stuff. So, and if anyone has any thoughts on any of these questions I raised, feel free to read it out, email. And again, huge thanks to Zeev and Kevin for joining today and for all the work they've done on this project. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thanks.